I entreat thee to discourse at large, and truly too how Troy was overcome, for many tales go of that city's fall.
A woeful tale bids Dido to unfold, whose memories like pale death's a stony mace beats forth my senses and from the troubled soul, and makes Aeneas sink at Dido's feet.
What faints Aeneas to remember Troy, in whose defense he fought so valiantly? Look up and speak.
Then speak I, Aeneas, with Achilles' tongue, and Dido, and you Carthaginian peers, hear me, but with the Myrmidon's harsh ears, daily inured to broils and massacres, lest you be moved too much with my sad tale. The Grecian soldiers were tired with the 10 years' war, and began to cry, "Let us return to our ships! Troy is invincible! Why stay we here?" With those outcries, Atrides began appalled, summoned the captains to their princely tent, who, looking at the scars the Trojans gave them, seeing the number of their men decreased, and with the remainder, weak out of the heart, gave up their voices to dislodge at the camp. And so in troops all marched to Tenedos. When they came, Ulysses on the sand essayed with the honey words to turn them back. And when he spake, to further his intent, the winds did drive huge bellows onto the shore, and heaven with the dark and tempestuous clouds. Then the alleged gods would have them stay, and prophesied that Troy should be overcome. And therewithal he called forth Sinon on forth, a man compact of craft and perjury, whose ticing tongue was made of Hermes' pipe, and forced 100 watchful eyes to sleep. And him, Epeus having made the horse, with sacrificing wreaths upon his head, Ulysses sent into our unhappy town, who groveling in the mire of Xanthus' banks, his hands bound at his back, and both of his eyes turned up to heaven as one resolved to die, our Phrygian shepherds hailed within the gates, and brought into the court of Priamus, whom he used actions so pitiful, looks so remorseful, and vows so forcible, and therewithal the old man did overcome, kissed him, embraced him, and unbound his hands, and then, "O Dido, pardon me."
Nay, leave not here, resolve me of the rest.
Oh, the enchanting words of that base slave made him to think the Epeus pine tree horse that sacrificed to appease Minerva's wrath, and rather that one Laocoon, breaking a spear on the hollow breast of the horse, and his 2 winged serpents stung him to death. Whereat, aghast, we were commanded straight with reverence to draw it into Troy, in which unhappy work as I employed, these hands did help wheel it to the gates, through which it could not enter, it was so huge. Oh, had it never entered, Troy would have stood. But Priamus, impatient of the delay, enforced a wide breach of the rampant wall, which 1,000 battering rams could never pierce. And so came this fatal instrument, at whose accursed feet, as overjoyed, we banqueted till overcome with wine, and surfeited others, soundly slept, with Sinon viewing, caused the Greekish spies to haste Tenedos, and tell the camp that then he unlocked the horse, and suddenly from its entrails Neoptolemus, setting his spear upon the ground, leapt forth, and after him 1,000 Grecians more, whose stern faces shined in the quenchless fire that broke the pride of Asia. By the camp they had come into the walls, and through the breach they had marched into the streets, where they meet the rest. "Kill, kill," they cried. Frightened with his confused noise, I arose, and looking from the turret might behold young infants swimming in their parents' blood, headless carcasses piled on the heaps, virgins half dead, dragged by the golden hair, and with the main force flung on a ring of pikes, old men with swords thrust through their aged sides, kneeling for mercy to the Grecian lad, who with a steel pole axes dashed out their brains. Then I buckled on my armor and drew my sword, and thinking to go down came Hector's ghost, with an ashy visage, bluish sulphur eyes, and his arms torn from his shoulders, upon the breast furrowed with wounds which made me weep, thongs at heels by which Achilles' horse drew him around the Greekish camp, and burst from earth, crying, Aeneas, fly! Troy is afire! The Grecians have the town!
O Hector, who weeps not to hear thy name.
Yet I flung forth, in desperate of my life. I ran through the thickest of throngs, and with this sword I sent many of their savage ghosts to hell. At last came Pyrrhus, full and of ire, his harness dripping with blood, and on his spear mangled the head of Priam's youngest son. And after him, the band of Myrmidons, with balls of wild fire in their murdering paws, which made the funeral flame that burnt fair Troy, and which hemmed me about and crying, This is he!
Ah, how could poor Aeneas escape their hands?
My mother Venus, jealous of my health, conveyed me from their crooked nets and bands, so I escaped furious Pyrrhus' wrath, and who ran to the palace of the king, whom at Jove's altar, finding Priamus, around whose withered neck hung Hecuba, found both his hands and hers, jointly both beating their breasts and falling on the ground. He with his falchion's point raised up at once, and with Megare's eyes stared at her face, threatening 1,000 deaths at every glance, whom she and the aged king remembered thus spake, Achilles' son, remember that I was father of 50 sons, but they are slain, lord of my fortune, and my fortune's turned, king of this city, but my Troy is burned. And now I am neither father, lord, nor king. Yet who's so wretched and desires to live, oh, let me live, great Napolitamus, not moved at all, but smiling at his tears. This butcher, whilst his hands were held up, treading his breast and stroke off his hands.
Oh, end, Aeneas, I can hear no more.
At which the frantic queen leapt up onto his face, and in the eyelids hanging by the nails, a little while pondering her husband's life. At last the soldiers pulled her by the heels and swung her howling in an empty air, in which an echo sent to the wounded king, whereat he lifted his bedrid limbs, and he would have grappled with Achilles' son, forgetting both his want and strength of hands, which he disdaining, whisked his sword about, and with the wind therefore the king fell down, and from the navel to the throat at once he repped old Priam open, whose later gasped Jove's marble statue again began to brow, as loathing Pyrrhus for their wicked act. Yet he, undaunted, took his father's flag and dipped it in the king's cold, chilled blood, and then in triumph ran into the streets, through which he could not pass for slaughtered men. So leaning on his sword, he looked stone still, viewing the fire whereby rich Ilion burnt. And this, I got my father upon my back, and this young boy in mine arms, and by the hand I led fair Creusa, my beloved wife, and thou, Acantes, with thy sword, mad this way, I were around with the Greeks, Oh, and I lost my wife, and had we not fought so manly, and I would not tell this tale here. Yet manhood would not serve. Of force we fled, and we went into our ships. Thou knowest, we saw Cassandra sprawling in the streets, whom Ajax ravaged in Diana's fame, her cheeks swollen with the size of her hair all rent, whom I took up to bear into our ships. But suddenly the Grecians followed us, and I, alas, was first to let her lie. Then we got into the ships, and being aboard, Polysena cry out, "O Aeneas, stay! The Greeks pursue me! Stay and take me in!" Moved with her voice, I leapt into the sea, thinking to bear her to my back aboard, for all of our ships were launched into the deep. But as I swam, seeing her on the shore, she was by the cruel Myrmidon surprised, and she was by that Pyrrhus sacrificed.
I die with melting wrath. Aeneas, leave.